Thank you all for joining us today. I am Lane Norton, Assistant Dean for Advancement in the Maxwell School, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this virtual faculty forum in partnership with the College of Engineering and Computer Science and the Clean Energy Futures team. Before we begin our conversation, we acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral land Syracuse University now stands. We also acknowledge and support those struggling against institutional racism and structural violence, and who are working toward a better future today. Today's event continues virtual programming for Maxwell and ECS to engage our faculty, alumni, and friends on important topics of the day. We're delighted that Maxwell Dean David Van Slyke and Engineering and Computer Science Dean Cole Smith are joining us today. We are recording this event and will post the recording on the Maxwell YouTube channel so that alumni and friends who could not join us can watch as well. If you do not want your image recorded, please feel free to disable your video camera by clicking on the icon on the lower left corner of your screen. Also, we are also pleased to provide closed captioning during our program. If you would like to view closed captions, click the CC button in the toolbar. Later in the program, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. When we get to the portion of the program, please raise your virtual hand using the raise hand button at the bottom of the participant list. This can be accessed by clicking on the participants icon on the bottom of your screen, and please leave your hand raised. We will call on you in the order and ask you to unmute your microphone, then you may ask your question. When you're not speaking, we ask that you keep your microphone on mute to lessen the noise for others. If you prefer to type your question, you may click the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and enable the chat box, and we will ask your question for you. On to our program. I am delighted to welcome several of the researchers involved in the Clean Energy Futures project. Professor Charles T. Driscoll is University Professor of Environmental Systems and Distinguished Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering in Syracuse University's College of Engineering and Computer Science. Professor Driscoll also serves as the science lead for the Clean Energy Futures project. Also a member of the Clean Energy Futures team, Professor Pete Wilcoxon is a professor of public administration and international affairs, a Jello professor in energy and environmental policy, Laura J. and L. Douglas Meredith Professor for Teaching Excellence at the Maxwell School, and the director of the Center for Environmental Policy and Administration. Kathy Fallon Lambert is the Clean Energy Futures project's policy engagement lead. She is director of the Science Policy Exchange and senior advisor at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health Center for Climate, Health, and the Global Environment at Harvard University. Charlie, Pete, and Kathy, thank you for joining us today. Kathy, would you like to begin?
Great, thank you so much, Lane. I'm very pleased to be here today to share some insights from our Clean Energy Futures project. As you will hear, there are many paths to a clean energy future in the electricity sector, and they vary somewhat in their outcomes, but they deliver far greater benefits than the current policy in place, known as the Affordable Clean Energy Rule. Next slide, please. So this is the Clean Energy Futures team, and as you can see, we have collaborators from multiple institutions working across different disciplines. And this work had to start back in 2014 when we first began looking at the comparisons of different approaches to reducing carbon emissions from power plants. Today, you'll hear from myself giving you the policy background and the research methods, followed by Pete Wilcoxon, who will share the results for carbon emissions and different policy costs. And then we'll wrap up with Charlie Driscoll, who'll talk about co-pollutant emissions and compare across the different policy options. Next slide. So a central idea behind all of this work is the importance of co-benefits. So what are co-benefits? Co-benefits are considering the total impacts or total benefits of a given policy to address power plant emissions. The generation of electricity from power plants can emit carbon dioxide emissions, which circulate globally and contribute to climate change. In the context of carbon and clean energy policy, these carbon dioxide emissions are what we call the target pollutant. But importantly, these same sources can also emit many other pollutants that come along for the ride, These are known as co-pollutants and include sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, directly emitted particulate matter, and mercury. These co-pollutants can have impacts close to home, in local communities, and across the region. And they have well-documented air quality effects as precursors to ground-level ozone, fine particulate matter, and acid rain and mercury deposition. The effects include both human health effects and ecosystem effects, as you can see here. The good news is that by addressing CO2 emissions, it's also possible to generate co-benefits by addressing these other co-pollutants. Basically, we have the potential for a policy twofer. And these health benefits have been a large motivator for climate action. Not only will we have benefits to the climate in the long term, far away, but also the potential for human health and environmental benefits here close to home. It's also an important lens through which to evaluate potential future policy options, and is at the center of the Clean Energy Futures Project. Next slide. So as we've mentioned, the Clean Energy Futures Project is focused on the electricity sector. And this is a slide of total electricity generation. On the vertical axis is terawatt hours, and across the horizontal axis is time. And what it shows you is a couple of things. One, that there's been a marked increase in total electricity generation since after World War II. Another key takeaway is that coal generation has dropped off markedly in recent years since slightly after the early 2000s. You also see here in the red that natural gas has been the primary fuel that's taken the place of coal. There has been some increase in renewables, as you can see in the color bands at the top, and they now make up about 16% of total generation. Next slide, please. In addition to this marked transformation in the electricity sector, there's also been marked policy changes during the same time period. This is a timeline showing major policy and legal changes over time from about 2007 to the present. And to hit just a few key high points, I want to point out that 2007 was the Supreme Court ruling that gave the EPA the authority to regulate carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions as a pollutant. In 2009, EPA made a determination called the endangerment finding that CO2, methane, and 4 other greenhouse gases were actually a risk to public health and welfare, which then required EPA to issue regulations for those pollutants. In the middle of the timeline, we have a number of different policy advances, which basically reflect EPA's efforts to promulgate a rule, starting with the Clean Power Plan, to address carbon dioxide from new and existing power plants. As many of you may know, that Clean Power Plan has since been repealed and replaced by something called the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, and litigation is currently underway to determine the fate of that new rule. And then importantly, in recent years, there's been a whole new suite of proposals introduced that represent a much more transformative policy approaches to reducing emissions from the energy sector, starting with the introduction of a resolution called the Green New Deal in 2019, and then notably this year, a House Select Committee report calling for economy-wide net zero emissions by the year 2050, and a similar platform from the Biden campaign calling for zero emissions in 2035 in the electricity sector and net zero carbon emissions in 2050 economy-wide. So together, both the previous graph showing the changes in the electricity sector in this policy timeline end at the year 2020. And we've come through a period of marked transformation, both in the policy landscape and the energy landscape. And it begs the question, what may happen next? Next slide, please. That is the focus of the Clean Energy Futures Project. what might happen from here, and how do different electricity sector policies compare? And specifically, how do they compare in terms of carbon dioxide emissions, system costs, co-pollutant emissions, and then looking forward, we're also looking at the distribution of benefits that may occur under these different policies due to changes in air quality and environmental effects. Importantly, I also want to note that at this point, the analysis is focused on direct energy sector emissions associated with generation and does not yet include the effects of energy production or the life cycle effects of different policy approaches. Next slide, please. So how are we addressing this question of how do the policies compare? The first thing we do is we start with a set of policy scenarios. So you can see on the left, we have a reference case called business as usual, and we have a set of 10 policy scenarios. And for all of those, we use a model called the integrated planning model, which is a model commonly used by EPA and regulatory analysis to look at changes in generation, the emissions, and program costs under each of the policies. At this point, we have completed those IPM runs, and we've used a tool to do an initial screening of the potential social impacts of the changes in emissions. Next slide, please. Going forward in the next phase of the project, what we'll do is use this emissions information in a model called CMAQ to simulate air quality differences across the continental US. And then from those air quality results, use a model called BenMap to estimate impacts on human health from changes in air quality. And then a series of additional environmental models to look at how deposition and air quality could change ecosystems, crop and timber productivity, and visibility. So today we'll be focusing on the blue and the purple boxes. Next slide, please. So in addition to what methods are we using, there's a question of what policies are we looking at. So I'm going to walk through a policy taxonomy here, starting with, at the very high level, what are some of the key differences? Well, one way to look at the range of policies we're considering is how strongly they're regulation-based or market-based. So in the case of a regulation-based standard, a facility or a sector may be required to meet specific technology or emissions standards. In the case of a market-based sector, there is a price or some other market-based instrument used to try and shift behavior. So we looked at a span of policies from regulation-based to market-based. Within those types of policies, we also have what are called inside the fence line, beyond the fence line, or pricing mechanisms, as I mentioned. Inside the fence line means that a policy applies just to a facility and only directed at what a particular plant might be able to change. For example, the heat rate of that plant. Could the efficiency of the plant itself be improved, and would that generate emissions benefits? That's an example of an inside the fence line type of standard. In the middle here, you see a beyond the fence line approach. So these are policies that consider what can happen sector-wide based on opportunities for energy efficiency, or fuel switching, or adopting of renewable energy sources. Some examples here include an emissions rate that might be set for the electricity sector based on what's achievable given a whole systems view. And that's the approach that the Clean Power Plan took. Then on the far right, of course, we have the carbon price option, which basically puts a price on carbon for every ton of carbon emitted from a plant. So it could be $25 per ton or $50 per ton. In between the ones that I just mentioned are two that are kind of quasi-market, quasi-regulation based, and they include the Clean Energy Standard and a national cap and trade policy. Both of these require that either a cap on emissions or a percent generation be from clean sources. And that requirement usually ramps down over time, and it could go all the way down to zero, so that either through an emissions cap or a clean energy requirement, emissions would have to reach zero at some point in the future. But in doing that, it would be through making credits or allowances available, that the numbers of which would decline over time and would be auctioned off and could generate revenue. Each of these standards could also include the possibility for banking or not banking under the policies. So on the next slide, we give you a list of the 10 different policies that we have been comparing to a business as usual or a no policy option. And so you'll be seeing these acronyms as we go. And so I thought it might be helpful to just walk through them one time here from the top so that you become accustomed to how to read them. On the left here, you see the type of regulation that is being analyzed, and those fall into the buckets that I just described. Under the code, you see a bunch of letters and numbers. The letters are abbreviations for the policy, so BAU is business as usual, and that's the first set of numbers. ACE is Affordable Clean Energy, CPP is the Clean Power Plan, and you can see down on through how they apply. CES is Clean Energy Standard, CAP is Cap and Trade, CP is Carbon Price. Next to the letters are a set of numbers. The numbers refer to the year. In the case of the Clean Power Plan, it's the year that we updated the Clean Power Plan requirements. In the case of the Clean Energy Standards, it's the year that the target has to be reached. And under the carbon price, the number actually refers to the dollar amount, the price per ton. And then finally, some of these cases have a suffix, a B, an H, or an L. So where you see a B, that means that banking is allowed and that there's another case in which there is no banking. Where there's an H, it's a clean energy standard that sets a high carbon intensity benchmark. And L means it sets a low carbon intensity benchmark. And that really is what defines which sources can qualify as clean under a clean energy standard. Before I hand it off to Pete, I want to emphasize that what you'll be hearing next is you'll be hearing about a lot of these different policy options. They have a wide range of possibilities for achieving a clean energy future. As you hear about their trade-offs, please keep in mind that all of these policy options make tremendous progress in both climate and clean air compared to the current ACE rule, which is the current law of the land. So we're going to talk a lot about the nuances among these cases, but the difference between all of these cases and the Affordable Clean Energy Standard is a very marked contrast that hopefully will come through as you see the outcomes for the different cases. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Pete.
Okay, thank you very much, Kathy. So I'm going to take you quickly through a very high-level overview of some of our results so far on carbon dioxide emissions and system costs. And so okay, there we go, sorry. And so before jumping into the actual numbers, I want to start with a quick summary of the high points, the takeaway lessons from the entire talk. And so to paraphrase what's written on the slide, lesson number one is we can do it. If there's one thing I want you to remember from this talk, it's that there are several options for bringing CO2 emissions down to almost zero by 2040 or 2050, and they can be done at reasonable cost. The second important thing to note is that the policies are not interchangeable. There are important trade-offs in the timing, the cost of the policies, and the emissions of co-pollutants, and we'll talk about that. And then the third thing that's important, which Kathy's also alluded to, is that the impacts would vary a lot over the country. They vary a lot with geography. And today we're going to talk about how they vary by state. And as Kathy mentioned, we're going later in the project to talk about how they vary by demographic group and within states. So those are the big high-level findings. To jump into some of the actual numbers, these two graphs show on the left what the policies do to CO2 emissions. And on the right, they show the annual system cost of the electric sector under each of the policies. So the first thing that I want to take you through is what happens to CO2 emissions in the long run. So that's at the right side of the left graph. So at the top, there are two runs that are actually almost identical there. One of them is business as usual, and the other is ACE. So ACE is almost indistinguishable from business as usual, and we'll actually use it that way in talking about the presentation results, or talking about the results during the presentation. The curve that's lower than that, that's about halfway down, that's the Clean Power Plan. So the Clean Power Plan would have made a significant dent in emissions, but it's a long way from bringing emissions down to zero in 2050. So it would have been a step in the right direction, but only a partial step. The $25 a ton carbon price is this purple line, and unfortunately my ellipse is kind of stepped on at the end. That would do more to bring emissions down in the long term, but it still doesn't get emissions to near zero in 2050. The remaining policies, though, all do achieve that. They bring emissions way down either by 2040 or 2050, depending on the design of the policy. So there are a range of policies that can get us down to zero or near zero in the long term. The next thing I want to point out about this graph, though, is that the policies differ a lot in their early impacts. So if we go back to 2025, you can see that some of these policies that eventually make large reductions don't make much impact at all in the short term. But there are other policies that actually bring emissions down quite a bit right at the outset. So the early impact is it varies a lot, and that's one of the important things to think about in the trade-offs between these different runs. Moving over to the right graph, you can see reflected in the cost, the system cost, the fact that taking early action raises early costs. So you can see this green line, which is the cap and trade run with banking. It produces the biggest reduction in emissions early on, but it also has the highest early cost. So early action involves early cost, and that's not surprising. What's perhaps more important to keep in mind is that not acting early and waiting to bring emissions way down in the future is expensive. So postponing emissions reductions produces some very high cost, relatively speaking, runs later on. All right. Digging into why there's a difference in the near-term impacts, it turns out that one of the big reasons has to do with banking of either emissions permits under the trading scheme, so that's what's shown in the left-hand side, or clean energy allowances, which is the graph shown on the right-hand side. So many people are probably familiar with banking, but for anyone who's not, when banking is allowed, firms, electric utilities, can choose to save emissions allowances they've been given early on and use them later. And as we've talked about, all these policies get more stringent over time. And so other things equal, that makes it harder to comply over time, more expensive to comply over time. And that provides a big incentive for firms to hang on to some of their permits that they're granted early on and use them later when otherwise it's going to be difficult to comply. If they want to hang on to permits, though, they have to do more emissions reductions in the near term. So the prospect of banking raises compliance early on. It raises emissions prices, as you can see in this diagram, in exchange for which it lowers emissions reductions a little bit in the future, and it lowers compliance costs. So it's a mechanism that can reduce costs and accelerate the impact of the policy. And that happens in the trading policies and in the clean energy standards when banking is allowed. A very high level overview of the difference in these policies is shown in this diagram. So what we care about for climate is the cumulative reductions in CO2 over the time that the policy that we're analyzing, which is 2020 to 2050. So it's cumulative emissions that make a difference for climate. And so that's what we've plotted here on the horizontal axis. So the x-axis is gigatons of avoided carbon emissions. And then to calculate the cost of the policies, we compute the present value, incremental cost of the system under each scenario relative to business as usual. And when we do that, the policies all fall into these three groups. So at the lower left is no real action, so that's business as usual and ACE. At the upper right are 5 high ambition policies, 2 cap and trade policies, 2 CES policies that aim for zero carbon emissions in 2040, and a $50 a ton carbon price. And then the remaining policies fall in the middle. Their ambition is more modest in terms of CO2 reductions, as is their cost. The impact of the policies on generating technology in the electric sector varies a lot depending on which policy option we use. So the upper left figure here shows the generating mix in the electric sector from 2020 to 2050 under ACE. And if you just glance at that for a moment, what really stands out is that under business as usual, there will be very little change under the business as usual, under ACE, which is almost the same as business as usual. There is almost no change in gas and almost no change in coal. And of course, that is at odds with what has happened in recent history. So ACE and business as usual both essentially freeze the electric sector's generating technology at the current pattern, except for a little bit of increase in renewable in the out years. For our purposes, that means that the business as usual case is a worst case scenario because it involves very, very little reduction in carbon emissions in the absence of policy. If you extrapolate from recent history, you'd expect more reduction in carbon emissions, even in the absence of a policy, and therefore lower cost of achieving some of these goals. With that said, here are a couple of other policy scenarios to show what happens under those policies to the energy sector. So moving to the right is the $50 a ton carbon price. And what you can see there is that coal is eliminated almost completely under that scenario by 2025, and it's completely gone by 2030. So a $50 a ton carbon price removes coal very quickly. Natural gas ends up being driven down almost to zero over the course of the simulation and pretty rapidly. And those two sources are replaced by wind, an expansion of solar, and by carbon capture and sequestration, which is shown here as CCS, which is a technology for capturing CO2 after it's been generated. And in here, most of the generation that's used for CCS is from burning natural gas. So this is natural gas burned with the carbon captured and sequestered, and in particular, 90% of the carbon captured and sequestered underground. The cap and trade with banking scenario and the CES, the aggressive CES with banking scenario, both of those also drive coal out of the market in the early part of the simulation. They drive natural gas down as well. Those two scenarios end up with less CCS and more solar. And the reason for that is that under these two lower scenarios, carbon emissions are capped by the end of the simulation by 2050. And so both of these have a hard limit on carbon emissions, and that's a disincentive for installing CCS. and capacity ends up being replaced by solar instead. All right, the impacts of the policies vary a lot by state. This is just a quick look to give you a flavor for how things work out. So this shows CO2 emissions impacts by state as percentage reductions from that state's emissions in 2020. And so you can see by 2050 that the 4 policies we just talked about have impacts on state level emissions that more or less match what you'd expect. So the carbon price, the cap and trade, and the CES run all eliminate essentially 100% of emissions in almost all of the states. And ACE actually allows emissions to increase in a number of states, but New York, California, Maine, there are a few states whose own energy policies will drive CO2 emissions down, even under ACE. In 2030, which is earlier in the simulation, the pattern is more mixed. The reduction in emissions is less uniform. There is greater variability, though, in the emissions of co-pollutants. And so now I will turn things over to Charlie to go through those results.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you, Pete. So this slide is similar to the one that Pete showed earlier for carbon dioxide. We have sulfur dioxides, which is one of the co-pollutants on the left-hand side, and nitrogen oxides on the right-hand side. So this represents a time series of emissions for these 2 co-pollutants over time based on the projections with the IPM model. So as Pete mentioned, for carbon dioxide, the business as usual is very similar to ACE. There's really no effective change in emissions of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide. However, for the other policies, they can really have very positive effects on reductions of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides. And for these co-pollutants, much like Pete mentioned for CO2, there's a lot of variability as when they would be implemented and when those reductions would occur. So this is very cool. As goes coal, so goes sulfur, and with mercury. So what do I mean by that? Well, this is a plot to show the role of coal in driving these co-pollutants, emissions of sulfur dioxide and mercury. So the red arrow points to the value in 2020. So these are all normalized for baseline values in 2020. So all the initial simulations started out at that time period. You can see that some of the simulations actually go up in terms of coal use and sulfur dioxide emissions, and those are business as usual in ACE over the 2020 values. But all the other scenarios drive down emissions of sulfur dioxide and mercury very strongly, with decreases in coal use in generation. This is a similar plot for the other 2 pollutants that we focused on, nitrogen oxide in the upper panel and carbon dioxide in the lower panel, again as a function of coal use. And you can see for these other pollutants, coal also has an impact. If we drive down the use of coal, we will greatly reduce these coal pollutants. At lower and lower levels of coal, however, there's some different behavior than we saw in sulfur dioxide and mercury. So we see for these scenarios here, the squares, the purple and the blue squares, there's actually increases in nitrogen oxides. And those are for the carbon price scenarios. And that results from a shift in generation from larger units to smaller units that have less stringent requirements for their nitrogen oxide emissions. And then for the other scenarios, there's quite a bit of variability once we start to drill down to lower and lower nitrogen oxides, as we see for carbon dioxide. So this is a plot of state emissions for nitrogen oxide, state by state, very similar to what Pete showed for carbon dioxide. The series of maps on the left is for 2030, for the right, 2050. And a red shows an increase in emissions and greater, deeper shades of blue, so decreases in emissions. And you can see there's a lot of variability across these policies. ACE does relatively little, and indeed many states are showing increases in nitrogen oxide emissions. The other high ambition programs have a lot of variability in terms of state response among the intermediate year in 2030, but they do a better job in terms of driving down emissions for the cap and trade and the clean energy standard. But because of that generation by small emitting sources, the $50 a ton carbon price scenarios show number of states with rather substantial increases. Now, as Kathy mentioned, one of the things that we're interested in this project is to try to monetize and do a cost-benefit analysis. So we use this tool easier as a preliminary approach to try to get a handle on this. So these represent maps similar to the emission maps, but they are monetized due to co-benefits associated with changes in sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide emissions. Again, 2030 on the left, 2050 on the right. And again, the red colors represent disbenefits, where the blue colors represent reductions in damages. So again, ACE does little, and indeed in many states there are significant disbenefits. And with the other high ambition policies, you generally see net benefits. And in particular, I would call your attention to areas in the Midwest, in the Ohio Valley, Texas. And these areas have been challenged historically in terms of air quality problems. And so this is good news for those local regions in terms of improving their local air quality. So this is our first shot at trying to do a cost-benefit analysis. So this plot represents ACE on the far left, and then the high ambition policies that Kathy talked about originally. So if you look at the y-axis, you can see that the bar goes up and down from 0. So below, the green portion of the bar represents the costs, and the upper part of the bar represents the benefits. They're estimated for climate, that's in terms of orange, and the health benefits for sulfur dioxide in blue and nitrogen oxides in brown. So there's a couple of things I'd like to point out here in this slide. First of all, again, ACE does very little. For the high ambition policies, you can see that the benefits are much greater than the costs. So there's a very favorable cost benefit ratio. The next thing I'd like to talk briefly about is the role of banking. Pete talked a little bit about that, but you see that play out in this cost benefit analysis. So for the cap and trade, the second bar has no banking, where the third bar has banking. You can see that there's a slight increase in cost, but there's a relatively substantial increase in benefits. The banking comes into play to a greater degree in the fourth and fifth bars, which represent the clean energy standard, So with banking, which is the fifth bar, the one on the right, you can see the cost is lower and there's substantially more benefits. So these play out in terms of our overall assessment. So just to wrap up and recap what we talked about, Pete talked about for our key findings, there are several high ambition policies with modest costs that can really achieve substantial climate and health benefits. But there are differences in the types of policy. The type of policy matters, and that's particularly true for co-pollutants. All these high ambition policies drive down coal, which result in large reductions in sulfur dioxide and mercury, and that's very good news. There's a lot of variability in terms of NOx emissions, and particularly the carbon price scenarios will result in a transition in a generation to smaller units, which can result in higher NOx emissions. The policies with stringent targets and timelines without banking reach the zero or near zero emissions earliest, and that's very desirable in many quarters. And then banking lowers costs, and together with a stringent policy target, achieves early emission reductions and larger cumulative benefits, not only for carbon dioxide, but for the co-pollutants. And as we said, the impacts vary by state, and just to reiterate, ACE doesn't do very much. So what are our next steps? Well, we have a policy brief, which is in development. We hope to finalize over the next week or so and publish that. If people are interested, we can make that available to you. You can send me an email and we can distribute that when it's finalized. The next step is with our colleagues from Georgia Tech to do air quality modeling with the CMAQ. And I've got a slide to illustrate some of this right here. So we use this detailed spatial analysis with this air quality model. These are simulations of changes in fine particulate matter for 1 year, 2030, where we compare ACE with business as usual. A blue shade represents a decrease in fine particulate matter. A red shade represents an increase. And as you can see for the upper panel, ACE doesn't do very much. But if we compare this to the other scenario, happens to be a clean energy standard, you can see a large blue area for much of the country, particularly in the eastern US where air quality is challenged. And so we're going to be doing these simulations for all the scenarios and looking at the air quality results. We will then take those air quality results and we will simulate human health and ecosystem outcomes using a variety of models. And then importantly, we're going to look at the distribution of these effects in terms of cost and air quality for different populations, different groups of people by race, ethnicity, and income. So with that, I will like to open it up for questions, and I appreciate your patience.
Thank you, Charlie. We will go ahead with questions now. To ask a question, please use the raise hand prompt at the bottom of the participant list to raise your virtual hand. Leave your hand raised and we'll call on you in order. We ask that when we call on you, you unmute your microphone and then you can ask your question. If you're not speaking, we do ask that you please mute your microphone to lessen the noise for others. And if you would prefer, you can also use the chat prompt to type your question in the chat box and we will ask it on your behalf. Who has our first question?
Lane, it looks like Stephen Sobel has our first question.
Stephen, if you want to unmute and ask your question. Stephen, it looks like you're still muted. If you want to unmute and ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me now?
We can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My question had to do with externalities and how much you've taken a look at two specific externalities affecting your modeling. The first externality is the availability of capital, and the second is cybersecurity. To what extent have you considered the availability of capital for new emerging technologies that would have a dramatic impact on your models? And second, what externalities have you assumed concerning cyber attacks against new emerging technologies? Thank you.
So I can take a stab at that. So the answer to your first question is that the IPM model has a detailed planning component that takes into account the cost of capital and the cost of new generation technology in deciding what to build over this horizon. So it, the access to capital is definitely taken into account in the analysis. Access to technologies which are not in the marketplace at the moment is not included. So what's in the model now is, at least as far as I know, is only existing or near technologies. So things that might come along further down the road would reduce costs further and are not in the model now. As far as cybersecurity goes, the model does not assume any change in vulnerability under any of the policy scenarios that we run. So whatever vulnerability there is in the base case, we assume is carried over to the policy cases as well. And so that's really netted out of this analysis at the moment.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Jim Agello. We are very delighted to have Jim here. He has generously been supportive of the Center for Environmental Policy and Administration, including helping Pete with the Agello Professorship. So thank you, Jim. Please ask your question.
Thanks, Lane. And so Pete and Charlie, as you probably know, I know Pete knows this, I've been in the electric sector for a long time. And so nothing gets me more excited than to see these kinds of analyses. But even old guys in the electric sector think about other things. And one of the things that I think about is, what are the guys in the transportation sector doing? Oftentimes, if you look across the country, you'll see that 30%, sometimes more, of the problem that you're identifying is really associated with the transportation sector. In some of the markets where I consult, and one or two where I work, I find that the transportation sector on the commercial side is moving very nicely, but we get stuck very easily on the residential side. And I know we'd all cite the same progress, expected progress with electric vehicles and that sort of thing. But I'm wondering if this analysis in the future could layer on top of what Pete and Charlie have done with the pollutants and co-pollutants, and adding the transportation sector to give us the total picture of where this stands. And that's my question.
Well, that was a great question that really plays into what our interests are. So thank you very much, Jim, for that. So the group that funded this, the JPB Foundation, was interested primarily in the electric utility sector. But we have been talking about expanding this analysis to include the interplay between the utility sector and the transportation sector, to look into the electrification of the fleet. What are the air quality implications, like you say, NOx, fine particulate matter, very, very important from transportation. It's really critical that we do it in a holistic way. So that's very much on our radar screen, and we very much would like to do that next step. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, and I would suggest to you that there are some synergies, obviously, as we electrify the transportation sector. We're going to impact the electric generation sector. So it would be a really nice icing on the cake. And so I'm delighted to see that there could be some plans, I guess, subject to funding.
Yep. Thank you.
Could I just add briefly to that there's you may have heard of this, Jim, but there's something called the Transportation Climate Initiative for 12 Northeast Mid-Atlantic states. And the idea is to develop a regional cap and invest program for transportation. So the investments would go toward things like electrification of public fleets, as well as incentives for the private sector. And also there's some expectation that there be a modest price effect on transportation patterns and driving habits that would also drive down emissions. And that interplay between the increased electrification and the transportation sector definitely, I think, adds an imperative to even doing what we can to make the grid as green as possible. Because overall, decarbonizing economy-wide is going to really demand shifting toward electrification and greening up the grid to get there. And I hope we do get a chance to look at those combined scenarios.
Thank you, Kathy. Next up, we have Terry Herman in the chat box. Terry asks, what assumptions are made in the models to address significant contributions of intermittent generation sources, wind, solar, and their effects on grid stability and the potential for brownout events? Terry also asked, what accounts for the higher emission in the northeastern states under the CP50 scenario?
Well, the answer to the first part of the question is that the model has a detailed capacity component, which makes sure that in each part of the country, there's adequate capacity available online to cover some part of the generating units going offline. And so the model does attempt to address the potential issues that come up with intermittent renewables. So there have been some cases in the past where large amounts of wind, for example, have gone offline, and you need to have capacity available to cover that. And that is included in the model. As far as the Northeast goes, that is largely, if you're looking at the NOx results, that's largely these small generators that are under 25 megawatts, and as Charlie mentioned, have poor emissions controls. And so that's an unfortunate side effect that comes up in the carbon pricing runs.
Next up, thank you, Pete. Next up, we have George Schaefer, former Maxwell board member, with his hand raised. George, nice to see you.
Well, first, let me say I'm disappointed that Jim Magello, my long-term friend, referred to himself as an old hand rather than use the word experienced. But I'll have to talk to him over a bottle of Bordeaux about that one. Good to see you all again. You refer to some of these options as having a modest cost and I'd like you to maybe elaborate a little bit on that. Modest cost related to what, and then how does that compare to outside the U.S. The competitive environment, if we are picking up that quote unquote cost and other societies or manufacturers or whatever don't, what does that have in a relative sense?
So thanks for the question, George. So I'll take the first shot at that. So what I meant by modest is that the overall present value system cost increment for these aggressive policies is about 15% of business as usual. So, if you just kind of squint at it, for a 15% cost premium over what on average we pay for electricity now, we can decarbonize the electric sector. And so by comparison to what a lot of people have talked about the cost of getting emissions down, it's really pretty manageable, especially over a 30-year time horizon. So in terms of electric bills, so this is another thing that we'll be looking at when we get into the detailed analysis. In terms of the electric bills that individuals face, they would be going up, depending on what state they're in, somewhere between something like $10 to $15 a month, depends. So to my mind, that's modest in the sense that this is not talking about thousands of dollars or hundreds of dollars. It's something it's definitely not free, but it's not as high as a lot of people seem to think.
Thank you, Pete. We are getting close to our hour, but we do have many questions left in line. If our speakers are comfortable, we will go ahead and continue so we can make it through these questions. Okay.
Sure.
Next up in the chat, we have Roan asking, states have led climate policy for the last 20 years, including RPS requirements, tax and incentive policies, regional GHG trading programs. Have you looked closely at these programs and the impact that they are making in both air emissions reductions and job creation?
Well, thanks for the question, Ron. We have not, this is a prospective study looking at what these proposed policies would do to future emissions. It's not a retrospective study, and I think you're asking about what historically has happened, and those are good questions. But that's not the focus of this study, though. I hope you're pleased to see that there's a lot more solar in the mix.
I am, Pete. And if you could hear me, I guess the question I would kind of slightly modify it is, we're looking at each policy individually. And when I step back and think about the solar industry or wind or any of the clean tech industries, and even the fossil fuel industry, they're built on literally a mutual fund approach towards policy, right? It's a little bit here, it's a little bit there, versus one size fits all. And for solar and wind included, the best policies that we've had have been tax policies. They haven't been the Clean Air Act. They haven't been environmental policies. It's really come from the tax code. And so one of the things I would just kind of encourage is, as you're evaluating the different policies, look at how they can be augmented with an extension of ITC, PTC, and some of the other provisions that might be more politically viable across both parties. And then I think it becomes really expansive in what they can do for reducing emissions. So thank you. You guys are doing a great job.
That's a very good point. Just to follow up on that, all the model runs that we are currently using follow current law, which assumes that the production tax credit for wind will end soon. And so if it were renewed and continued, we'd get more expansion of wind sooner. So that's a very good point.
We're working on it.
Thank you for your question, Roan. Next up with his hand raised, Gavin. If you'll unmute your microphone, you can ask your question.
Good afternoon, everyone. It was a fascinating presentation. I'm kind of building off of Roan's comments regarding states and the fact that states pursue policies in an uneven manner. The Northeast has been very aggressive in trying to reach net zero emissions, but other states could be inclined to do the opposite direction in order to take economic advantage over leakage. Also, as another point, there are also some pivots in technology, case in point, offshore wind. I'm familiar with most of the Northeast states investing billions in planned new offshore wind capacity in order to meet their goals. Were you able to hear me?
It did, up to a point, but it didn't sound like you asked a question, Gavin.
Okay. I'm wondering if the model can take in place an uneven passing of the policies, where a percentage of the GDP will pursue the policies first.
Yeah.
And then it will gradually become more widespread.
So the answer to that is, the answer to that is, boy, wasn't 10 runs enough? The answer is absolutely the model could do that, and it already does try to take into account differences in California and in the RGGI states, and it could do that. But you might have been able to read between the lines. We actually are already kind of pulling our hair out to try to track down exactly why all the differences arise in the runs we've already got. So we'll put that on our future to-do list. It could be done, but it would expand the dimension of analysis a lot.
Maybe I could add into that. We're particularly interested in air quality issues, and this piecemeal approach is not really helping that much in terms of air quality because of the nature of the source materials. So we really wanted to look at a national perspective and see what's achievable in terms of air quality in addition to climate benefits.
Great, thank you. Next from the chat box, we have Brent Encino. The question is, how do you get research results like these to be considered by policymakers?
We should let Kathy answer.
Yeah, that's a question for Kathy.
Thanks for that great question. I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is to include runs that are policy relevant, right? So the research itself, we have the opportunity to look at a number of different scenarios. And if we pick scenarios that are part of the policy conversation, the results themselves will be more relevant to decisions that policymakers have to make. So that's the first thing I think that we think about and that we tried to do in this project. The second is communications. So communications is part of this and other projects like this. And by that, we mean both front-end communications and throughout the project. So we try to make ourselves available and engage with legislators at the state level, as well as members of Congress and people in the agencies to understand the questions that they have and to make sure they're aware of the work that we're doing. And we do that right at the front end of the project. And then as results are available, of course, we are sure to organize briefings like this kind of briefing, but when we're a little bit further along, to share the results with key members of Congress and agencies. And then a a final piece is media. So a lot of times it takes reaching out to journalists and having the information make its way into the broader public for it to then have some influence with policymakers. So that will be part of this work as well.
Great, thank you, Kathy. Next, we have Jacob, a 2018 SU alum, asking, does the air quality impacts simulation focus only on displaced fossil generation and the uplift in air quality associated with it? Or might you be looking as well at life cycle emissions? For instance, if we displace coal, localized air quality at mines should markedly improve. But if we replace the nat gas and production rises, perhaps methane emissions from the wellhead increases. Curious what specifically is being modeled in these simulations.
So the air quality that's being modeled, the only things that we are changing is the different distribution of emissions from the electricity sector. So all the other emissions, transportation sources, other sources, natural sources remain constant. The one thing that we are changing in the simulation is we're doing simulations with and without changing climate. So some of you know that many of these pollutants have a so-called climate penalty, for example, ozone prominently. And so that under warmer temperatures, the air pollutants will form to a greater extent. And so there's definitely a climate component to this as well. But in terms of other aspects of the emissions, we're just trying to focus on what is the impact from the electricity sector.
Great, thank you. Just to clarify, Dan Rubio, your question has been answered. Do you have any follow-up?
No, that was fine. That was a good answer.
Great, thanks. We had a private question come in. New York's aggressive energy policy is forcing unwanted wind and solar projects. Upstate and central New York is a hotbed. Is this appropriate? How can we achieve energy goals and respect local voices?
Well, I'll take a shot at that. So what I think you're getting at is that sometimes renewable energy projects are unpopular with people who live near them, right? Examples of the NIMBY problem, not in my backyard. And IPM actually it tries to take that into account. So it has a limited supply of areas in the country that are suitable for large scale wind. And that's part of the reason, you know, if you've kicked around the electric sector for a while, you might wonder why wind doesn't expand more than it does in these runs. And the answer to that is partly that the model has baked into it limited availability. So we are not assuming that everyone's backyard is going to get turned into a wind farm here. And having said all of that, it is absolutely a critical public policy issue to work with people in the communities where these things would be sited to make sure that they're acceptable to the community and don't exacerbate any inequalities that already exist. And that goes not only for the new generation, but for new power lines, which would be required to connect some of these renewable energy sources to load centers in cities. So, you know, the question is right on target. These things really are going to require a lot of very careful and skilled work between policymakers and the communities if we're going to be able to move forward in this direction.
Thank you, Pete. It looks like our last question comes from Maggie Cherney. Maggie asks, given the policies each have similar long-term effects, do the presenters have recommendations for what policy would be more prudent to implement and why?
What, Kathy, do you want to take a shot at that?
Oh, I would answer this, I guess, a couple of different ways. I think that it's clear that energy has its costs and they vary. So each policy has different trade-offs. The policies, for example, that don't include banking get to some of the zero emission targets faster and tend to drive down fossil generation faster. The policies that have banking tend to get more early abatement and tend to be less expensive. So they have their benefits, but they also have their costs, and their downsides, I guess. And I would look at it from the perspective of what's the goal. So if the goal is to get to zero emissions as fast as possible, then that would lead you toward one policy. If getting early emissions reductions because of the importance of that to climate, then that might lead you to a different outcome. Pete, you want to?
Yeah, I just add a little bit, and it's probably not what you think, Kathy. So we are all, I think, individually tempted to pick winners, but I think the way that we think about this project is that that's not our job. Our job is to lay out for policymakers what all the pros and cons of the options are. As Kathy said, do you want your emissions reductions soon, or do you want them more thorough? Do you want the cost to be low, or do you want to aim technology in a particular direction? So we want to characterize all that, to lay out the full menu for policymakers, but it's above our pay grade to actually pick winners. Now, that's not to say that we don't want to or are tempted to, but we'll try to stay away from that in the reports.
This might be a good time to reiterate, however, that all of these would be winners compared to the current situation, like by a lot.
Yes, we can do this.
Great. Well, thank you, Kathy, Charlie, and Pete for a great conversation. And thank you to Maxwell's outstanding information and computing technology team for supporting this talk, and to the staff of the Maxwell Dean's Office for assisting with this event. Please watch your email for additional virtual event opportunities this fall, including Syracuse University's first ever virtual Orange Central that will include a panel discussion for Maxwell Women's History at Maxwell, Marguerite Fisher and beyond. And if you have any further questions, suggestions for future topics, or Maxwell faculty you would like to hear about or from, or the timing and execution of these events, please submit them to us at alum@maxwell.syr.edu. Thank you again, be well, and go Orange.